The only requirement that we have is the one that we're legally allowed to have, which is that accommodations are not retroactive. So students are told a lot, and it's also in print on their letter. I go over it with them, others go over it with them, that you can't go back in time. From the moment you give the professor the letter that you guys have a sample of, that's the moment that the professor can be held accountable. Because of confidentiality laws, I am not allowed to reach out to a professor and say, hey, this person has a learning disability, et cetera, if they have not actually given you the letter and disclosed themselves. What I encourage students to do is to give it to their professors during the first week. I know there's some schools that do place a deadline, but in real life, they actually can't enforce it. So I've thought about things like putting a priority date for students just to encourage them, but we can't actually require it. But I will say, just to back up a little bit, because that's the law and the policy, but just practically speaking, if you suspect that a student does have a disability, the best thing for you to do is to focus on what you've observed as being the issue in your class. So don't worry about what the diagnosis is or whether it exists. Focus on what you've actually seen. So I've noticed that, you could say to students, I've noticed that you were doing great in the beginning of the semester, but all of a sudden you stopped coming to class. And I'm wondering why. I want to help. I want to reach out. I want to make sure that you know what your resources are. And from there, you can focus the conversation on the academics. Even when I'm meeting with a student individually, we're not sitting there for an hour talking about the details of their disability. We're talking about the actual issues that they're experiencing in the classroom and what can be done about it. So when a student has come to me and provided the appropriate documentation, certain accommodations are selected. The accommodations are not made up by me. They're based on industry standards. They're based on previous case law with the Office of Civil Rights. It's based on Association for Education and Disability, also puts out guidelines. So it's relatively standard. If you are a student who's experiencing issues with paying attention in class and you have documentation from a doctor of that, then you would get on your letter something like you are allowed to have a volunteer note taker in your courses. So there has to be a link between the actual disability documentation and the accommodation. And the accommodation cannot alter an essential element of the class. So an accommodation would not be to reduce the number of assignments in a class or the number of test questions, but it could be an alteration to the method that instruction is received or the way that a student is evaluated. So it's not supposed to change the content that the student is expected to learn in the class. If when you get a letter, it looks like there's an accommodation on there that does conflict with an essential element of your class, please don't sign off on the student's letter. Please let the student know about your concerns and contact me so that we can discuss it. It's a very risky decision to decide to just not provide the accommodation because you don't think it works for your class. Now, if the accommodation listed does not apply to your class, so if it says exams on the accommodation letter, but your class does not have exams, you can just disregard it. It's fine. It can just be there on the letter. Okay, so this is Stanley Sampler's letter. So it has the current semester at the top. Every semester, the student has to request a new letter. They do not need to meet with me or submit new documentation. They can get this electronically. Unless they want to change the accommodations that they're approved for, they do not need to meet with me. So if a student has said that they don't have their letter to give you because they haven't gotten it from me, that's incorrect. They can just email access@Marymount for a copy. It just has their basic information, and for every student, we have the same generic tenets that we go over with them. Communicate with your professor. Please give them this letter. Your accommodations don't go into effect without the letter. Please use other resources like the counseling center, the tutors, your advisor. Under instructor, that's where we have that student-specific accommodations. When a student has an accommodation, like extra time exams, it's going to read exactly the same or close to the same on every student's letter. This doesn't apply to a homework assignment. This only applies to in-class exams. If a student has something like, if a student is allowed to, sometimes students confuse this for extra time on homework and projects. It's not. That, even though exam time extensions are the most common accommodations, extensions on homework and projects, that's rare. You don't really find that at every single university. For a variety of reasons, I'm sure you can imagine. We just don't standardly put on the letter that you're required to give extra time, specific amount of extra time on a homework assignment. If a student can demonstrate through their documentation that they really do have a history of needing to pace themselves or have things scheduled a certain way, they will have an accommodation in their letter that says that either that they get early access to instructions and content so they can start early, or an accommodation that's not in this sample, which says allowed flexibility with due dates to be negotiated with the instructor in advance. So that's a student who comes to you at the beginning and says, I've looked at my syllabus for all my classes and I've got this really clumped up week here. I've got anxiety disorder, as you can see from my letter, and is there any way that I can move that date to this date? When students have this accommodation, we try to counsel them on being specific with instructors. So not just saying, oh, I just need more time, but being specific about this is what I'm going to do instead in order to meet the requirements of the class. Underneath the accommodation, it always says that the student mustn't schedule with the instructor or the CTO testing center 2 or 3 days in advance. If they've asked the day of and you, out of the goodness of your heart, decide to provide that, that's great. But if for some reason you cannot, then we're not required to be unreasonable on our end. You know, they're protected by the law, but so is the university. We're supposed to be reasonable on both sides. You know, you would have to explain to that student that you're sorry. Maybe next time they should definitely plan ahead to take the exam in the center. I will say that there are some instructors, some departments that do not want the exams to leave their department, so they always provide their own exam accommodations. Sometimes students are confused by that if they've had a professor who who insisted on giving the exam accommodation themselves. They think that all the professors do. I think it's important to just go back to pointing back to the letter, and there's a page on the website about testing and a brochure about what their options are and what the procedures are. If the student does not follow the procedures that they've signed off on, then it defaults to them just taking it with the regular class, the regular time. They're saying, by not making those arrangements, they're saying, I wish to take my exam as it's written in the syllabus that it's going to be administered.